This next one was Natalie's, and she said, or it's about how research shows changing the narrative can open the door to conflict resolution. I thought this one was a pretty interesting one. It's all about in-group glorification and narratives of the out-group. And so the question is, can sharing perspectives or narratives of the out-group decrease in-group glorification? And then does decrease in-group glorification lead to decreased conflict? And then what are the roles of glorification and attachment in this potential relationship? And so they conducted 3 studies in accordance with these questions. And the first study was focused on so participants were assigned at random on one of 3 narratives related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the narratives included one that favored the in-group, one that showed the suffering for both the in-group and out-group, and then one that didn't acknowledge the out-group at all. And then participants were asked to identify the author's nationality, their own nationality, and then rate their thoughts on a number of questions related to in-group attachment. The second study
real fast. Sorry, what were the 3 conditions again?
It was one that favored the in-group, and then one that showed suffering for both the in-group and the out-group, and then one that didn't acknowledge the out-group.
Okay, so so the first one acknowledged both, but it favored the in. The other one acknowledged both, but showed suffering for both, and the other one didn't acknowledge the out-group at all. And were these Israeli participants?
I believe yes, 258 Israeli Jews.
Okay, so it was got it.
Yep. And so the second study, moving on, replicated a lot of study 1, but focused on Americans and the war on terror. And participants were provided one of 3 narratives related to the war with Pakistan. Again, one that favored the in-group, one that showed suffering for both the in-group and out-group, and then one that didn't acknowledge the out-group at all. And they were asked 2 open-ended questions and wanted to provide a summary of the article that they read. And then study 3 was different from the first.
Sorry, real quick. Sorry.
Of course.
Study 2, was that were those the same group of participants, or were those American participants?
Different American participants. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yep, different participants. All English-speaking Americans, 60% female, 40% male. Yeah. Then for study 3, we have it was done with, and I'll say this at the start this time, but there's 475 participants, all English-speaking Americans, and only new participants were allowed, so it wasn't anybody from the previous study. And they were asked several questions related to attachment and glorification, and then they read either a narrative that favored the in-group or a narrative that acknowledged both in-group and out-group suffering. And then additional questions were asked related to attachment and glorification, followed by questions related to restorative justice versus retributive justice, militaristic conflict resolution versus diplomatic conflict resolution, national reconciliation, and narratives at hand. And so this was the third study. And then the results from this were that in-group glorification decreases when a narrative showing the suffering of both in-group and out-group members is provided. And following this, there is a greater support to use more peaceful means to resolve conflicts when this both in-group and out-group suffering were displayed. However, this only occurred for those who held a lot of in-group or both in-group glorification and in-group attachment prior to the narrative. Those who only valued glorification saw an increase in less peaceful means, so as a means to resolve conflict. And so what Natalie took away from this was that exposure to alternative narratives, and specifically ones that recognize suffering for both the in-group and out-group, can decrease in-group glorification and encourage more peaceful reconciliation means, at least with those who have a strong attachment to their in-group, which is a good summary of the results. And then for consultants, creating ways to bridge the gaps to change the narratives for 2 people or multiple groups of people may be a key to at least starting to use peaceful means to resolve the conflict at hand and creating an openness to reconcile. So I'm interested to hear what you all think of this. I thought it was an interesting one.
Yeah, Yeah, really, really cool study. So if I'm reading this correct, the those who those who did not hold any in-group glorification or in-group attachment, there was no significant difference, right, between the groups. But so it didn't matter what the conditions were if they weren't attached or glorifying their in-group,
Mhm.
they didn't significantly change based on like the different conditions. Uh,
Yeah.
but if they glorified their in-group and they were attached to their in-group prior to the narrative, they they supported more peaceful means. But if they only glorified and weren't attached, I don't know how they're defining attachment, but they're only glorified, they actually the opposite effect happened. If they glorified their in group and then they read this narrative
Yeah.
about suffering, less peaceful means were even more pronounced, right?
Yeah.
Is that what?
Yeah. It makes me really want to know what they define as
Yeah, like
attachment,
what's the difference between attachment and glorification? I
glorification.
guess.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, I'm curious there too, because initially I was thinking this sort of reminded me a little bit of the study, I believe, from last week, where we talked about kind of the exposure to sadness and what that does and how that kind of releases a guard that a lot of parties in conflict will carry. And that's what I was thinking initially. So with suffering, you know, if you're attached to one narrative and then you're exposed to another that illustrates similar suffering or another type, something along the lines of sadness, right? Then you're going to be more likely to, again, release that guard and be more open to peaceful measures of resolving conflict.
Yeah.
But I'm confused, as you guys are talking about now, with those that saw the less peaceful means to resolve conflict. When they,
Yeah.
I don't really understand that part.
Well, and that was another thing that goes with this. And I think that's cool that you relate that to studying sadness, because I hadn't thought about that. But what Natalie wrote this in her article, and she said that so that those who hold their in-group in particular high esteem, that's where the results are in play. But she said if they're not strongly attached, there's an opposite effect, which I don't know.
Here, let me read this real fast.
Yeah.
So participants reported their identification with the in-group. Participants completed scales from Rokas and colleagues 2006 assessing in-group attachment. For example, it is important for me to help my country. It is important to me that others see me as Israeli.
Mm.
And in-group glorification, for example, there is usually a good reason for every rule and regulation that the leaders of our nation propose. Israel is better than other nations in all respects. So there's there's these constructs that people have used, attachment versus glorification.
Which that
It's
makes
like
sense.
it's like some part of like an identity part of the attachment of like
Right.
how close do you feel to your country, and then the other one is purely like, you know, how good is my country or something.
Oh, okay.
Right. Which actually kind of makes sense. If you would think that those who glorify over attach would see less peaceful means, or would want to do less peaceful means to resolve a conflict. If it's not, I guess, if it's not related to identity, and it's just related to country.
Yeah. So why do you any ideas as to why, if you do start feeling attached or identified and you also glorify, why would that affect it differently? Why would that attachment piece be the thing that affects whether or not you want peace or not peace when you read these suffering narratives?
It makes me think of absolutism and like extremism on the side of when we're talking about glorification, whereas attachment can be just a pride in attaching yourself to your national identity or that. Whereas I don't know, it makes me think that like extremism, absolutism, but I don't know, adding in the identity piece, I wonder if it humanizes it at all, or if I don't know.
I think it's because when you're attached, like thinking of attachment, you're putting yourself in the mix. Whereas when you're glorifying something, it's just almost like an idea. It's just an idea. It's just I'm not actually involved. So I'm not really like looking at myself as part of the problem, and maybe that's why. So like when you're attached, you're in it. You're in your. I don't know if that makes any sense, but like
I think you're I mean that's how I would think about it. I think you're hitting it on the head. I think there's if you identify with this entity and suddenly there's this potential that you're causing suffering, that you as part of
yeah,
the entity is causing suffering, it may make you want to cause less suffering. Whereas if you don't see yourself as part of the entity causing suffering and you're just purely sort of glorifying the entity, then it doesn't reflect negatively on you in some subconscious reflexive way, you know?
yeah.
Yeah.
I also wonder. I mean, I don't know if this. I'm just curious, like how you can glorify without being attached. I like personally, I don't know that I
Yeah.
can really comprehend that. I can have empathy for someone who glorifies an entity or a concept or a being of some sort without feeling like they're attached to it. You know,
Yeah.
I feel like those go hand in hand, but
Well, maybe like if you, for instance, if you like, if you had a sports team and you glorified your sports team, like, man, the Redskins are like the best over the whatever, or something like that. But I'm not part of that team. I, I don't identify as a team member, but I identify as a
as
fan, you know,
okay.
as
And
someone
I
who
guess,
helps glorify them or something. Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, even in like the political spectrum of this, I think that those that are maybe not don't necessarily feel the effects of certain policies and initiatives of a certain person in power, but yet they glorify that person. They might also not be likely to kind of
Yeah.
resolve a conflict because it's like they're not part of it. Yeah, okay, I can see that now. The difference between glorifying and attached.
Yeah. That's an interesting one. I was just thinking like if you, yeah, because if you glorify a team, you have some team, whether it's any social team, political team, sports team, whatever team, you glorify them, but you don't necessarily feel like you're a part of them. Then when they do bad stuff, it doesn't reflect poorly on you. You could just kind of separate and go, well, I'm not part of that team, you know.
Mhm.
But when they do well, like, yeah, go team. But I'm not really part of them. So when they do bad stuff, I don't need. But if you feel like I'm part of the team, and when they do bad stuff, that means I do bad stuff, you might start changing the way that you think about, you know, the potential for bad stuff.
Yeah, and bringing this into the workplace, I'm thinking this is actually reminding me of a situation from yesterday where it's like the narratives all seem to be, I mean, similar, but one individual was not identifying that they're part of it. They're feeling like they're outside of it, and they're just saying, yeah, what they say is fine, but not acknowledging that they're part of the situation. And so
Really?
really
Yeah.
like transforming, I mean, this takeaway is important, right? Because transforming the narrative will try to put yourself in this person's shoes, that type of thing, like empathy building. And you read their narrative from their perspective, like first person narratives. That type of work is really powerful. If somebody were to like write something out and then have one that doesn't necessarily agree with their narrative or see their side, read it, I feel like that can be
Yeah.
a powerful practice.
Yeah. That's actually really good. Well, and I think what's central here, I think what we're hitting on um, is the responsibility. Is, you know, if I don't identify but I glorify, I don't really take any responsibility for the suffering. But the minute that I actually identify with the group that's causing suffering, then I'm part of the group that's causing suffering. And so like in that workplace scenario, if someone's not willing to take responsibility for their part, whatever part that is of the conflict, then they're kind of detached from it. And that's what, like, I think that's part of like what we do is like help people figure out like what parts can I take responsibility and ownership for, so they actually have a part in the resolution.
yeah, like they're not,
I wonder if they measured personal responsibility, if that would be some sort of mediating factor in this relationship between attachment
and
and yeah,
glorification,
and,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
peace. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's a good one.
This is a good one, yeah.
Yeah.